Hey guys, welcome to Night Stories Sleep. Tonight we begin with the medieval peasant wedding, a celebration that somehow blended holy vows, livestock, drunk uncles, and the occasional fist fight into what can only be described as a deeply rustic fever dream. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. There were no invitations, no gilded parchment, no wax seals, not even an angry raven dropping scrolls on rooftops. In the medieval village, weddings spread by one method only: gossip. It usually started with a whisper at the well. "Did you hear? Tomas is marrying Beatrix." A day later, it reached the baker, who told the miller, who told the midwife, who told literally everyone she passed, whether they cared or not. By nightfall, even the sheep knew someone was getting married. The priest, notably, was always the last to find out. There was no such thing as being uninvited. If you were alive and within walking distance, you went. Not because you were particularly close to the couple, but because weddings meant food and drink and maybe a fist fight if things got festive. The bride and groom didn't draw up guest lists. They had no control over who came. You could end up with 10 people or half the county. That's just how it worked. More people meant more gifts, which in peasant economics translated to possibly getting an extra chicken or sack of turnips. Valuable stuff if you're living on gruel. Of course, you had to plan for guests showing up, but you also had to plan for guests not showing up. Some might be dead, some might be drunk, some might just forget. One guy was still harvesting barley and didn't notice the entire wedding happened without him. Because let's be clear, time was flexible. Noon could mean anywhere between breakfast and sunset. There were no watches, just the sun and people's vague ability to guess how far it had moved since they last looked up from milking a cow. The bride and groom weren't fussed about seating charts or name cards. You sat wherever your behind landed, log, stone, or haystack. And if the pig had already claimed your seat, well, too bad. Pig stays. In the medieval peasant world, formal wear was more of a suggestion than a standard. Fashion in this context wasn't about trends or elegance. It was about not being naked and maybe brushing the straw out of your hair. The bride did her best. She wore her nicest dress, which, to be fair, probably wasn't white. White fabric was impractical, expensive, and a magnet for every farm animal within a 2-meter radius. Instead, she wore brown or gray or off-gray, which had once been white before 3 harvests and a sheep-related incident happened to it. She might weave a crown of wildflowers if it was spring, or ribbon from something vaguely decorative like an old curtain or someone's spare belt. She didn't expect to look like a queen. She just hoped to look like someone who hadn't been digging onions all morning. The groom, meanwhile, tried to look respectable. He might wash his tunic, he might comb his hair, assuming he still had some. If he had shoes, they went on. If not, barefoot it was. Calloused feet were considered rustic, not rude. And if he smelled vaguely like pig, well, so did everyone. Hygiene was relative. Soap existed, but not the kind you'd want near your eyes. Bathing was done seasonally or when it rained, so most guests didn't arrive sparkling clean. They arrived recognizably human. That was enough. Accessories were rare, but meaningful. A belt with an extra pouch, stylish. A hat with feathers, bold. A tooth still in place, luxury. No one owned jewelry unless it was stolen or passed down from a great-grandmother who had once kissed a merchant. Children arrived smeared in mud, proudly displaying whatever insect or twig they'd found on the way. Old men wore the same wool cloak they wore every day. Old women, wrapped in layers, cast judgmental glances at everyone, muttering, "When I got married," under their breath. But no one cared if your hem was frayed or your sleeves didn't match. This wasn't a fashion show. This was a rare break from labor, a communal moment of joy, and if you arrived with both your boots and your teeth, you were practically nobility. The venue was wherever there was a patch of churned up mud generously seasoned with manure. Guests arrived wearing their wedding boots, which were just their regular boots, but with a resigned expression. There were no chairs, no bunting, no altar made from reclaimed oak. People stood or squatted or leaned against fences that creaked ominously. Sometimes someone brought a bench, and the elders claimed it immediately, like royalty without a throne. Everyone else just tried not to fall into a ditch. The decorations? Nature, mostly. Weeds. If someone hung a few flowers or ribbons around a fence post, It was considered Martha Stewart-level ambition. The rest of the setting was filled in by animals, dogs sniffing everything, chickens absolutely underfoot, and the occasional confused goat photobombing the betrothal. And then there were the smells. Pigs in the next field, sheep nearby, the faint but persistent scent of cabbage stew simmering in someone's pot. Combined with sweat and ale breath, it was less a wedding ambiance and more a medieval cologne sampler. But still, people showed up, because setting didn't matter. This was a rare break from the grind of survival. The wedding could be held in a puddle surrounded by compost, and it would still be better than weeding barley all day. By the time the bride and groom stood before the priest, most of the guests were already itchy, sunburned, or 3 cups of ale into the celebration, which was fine because the ceremony itself wasn't exactly a Shakespearean affair. It was short, it was awkward, and if the priest had somewhere to be afterward, it was even shorter. For medieval peasants, marriage wasn't about flowers, rings, or tearful vows. It was mostly about contractual clarity. The church, by the 11th century, had begun to insist on a priest's involvement, but truth be told, many couples considered themselves married the moment they declared their consent in front of witnesses. I take you as mine, and you take me as yours. That was the gist. Romantic in a highly practical, tax-liable way. Some ceremonies included a blessing and a few Latin mutterings. No one backed out before sundown. Consent was the key. Both parties had to agree out loud and in front of others. If the bride said nothing and looked like she might bolt, the priest technically had to delay things, but often a stern glance from a parent or a reminder of dowies already exchanged moved things along fast. And that was it. No organ music, no flower petals, no long speeches, just 2 peasants standing in a muddy yard saying yes to a future of shared labor, screaming children, and, if they were lucky, a second serfs, or good if you were really optimistic. In the medieval world, 2 stomachs were easier to fill than 1, and more children meant more hands to help with labor. It was less about passion and more about breaking even. The feast? Well, that was an epic undertaking, involving a cauldron that had been boiling for hours and contained roughly half the village's hopes and all of its root vegetables. The centerpiece of the meal was usually a stew bubbling in a cauldron the size of a small cart. Into it went cabbage, leeks, onions, barley, turnips, maybe some dried peas, and if you were really lucky, a bit of meat, a chicken if someone had been feeling generous or reckless. Otherwise, flavor was left in the hands of salt or fate. Guests didn't sit at tables. They found a rock, a bench, or a sturdy dog. Bowls were passed around, and if you didn't bring one, you had to eat from your hands or borrow your neighbor's. Spoons were wooden, shared, or theoretical. Fingers did most of the work. Drinks were better. Ale was plentiful, home-brewed, and stronger than expected. It went down fast, burned slightly, and made even burnt stew taste like joy. Water was technically an option, but most people avoided it since it often doubled as a bacteria cocktail. Ale, safer and more festive. Bread, when available, was dense enough to stun a pig. It was either fresh and sour or old and sharp enough to qualify as a weapon. Cheese made appearances too, but only if the cow had been kind that week. There were no desserts unless someone brought berries or dried fruit, and no one trusted the berries. Still, it was abundance by peasant standards. A second bowl, a third, that was luxury. Children raced around with crusts in hand. Elders gnawed contentedly, gums be damned. Dogs wandered underfoot, receiving more food than usual and less appreciation than they deserved. Wedding gifts weren't about sentiment, they were about survival. Guests brought what they had, a couple of eggs, a chunk of hard cheese, a chicken tied by its feet, or in truly generous cases, a small sack of grain. These weren't presents so much as practical investments in the couple's new life together, because nothing says congratulations on your lifelong binding contract like a half-dozen turnips. Occasionally, someone would arrive with something a bit more interpretive, an old hoe missing a handle, a wooden spoon. They practically royalty. Sometimes gifts were recycled, and yes, that's as medieval as it gets. A goose given at your wedding might reappear at your cousin's wedding a year later, slightly older and angrier. There were whispers of one clay jug making the rounds for over a decade. No one remembered where it came from, no one dared keep it. But the gifts weren't just for the couple. They also played a role in community optics. Giving something useful proved you were invested in the household's success. It signaled goodwill, participation, and maybe a hope that when it was your turn to marry, someone would return the favor with a particularly plump chicken. And despite the randomness and re-gifting,
There was warmth in it. These weren't luxurious things, but they were what people could spare. In a world where most had little, giving anything at all was an act of generosity, even if it squawked the whole way there. Every medieval village had its own cast of characters, and they all showed up at weddings, uninvited. You'd also spot the retired soldier who hadn't fought a battle in 30 years, but still wore part of his dented helmet and told the same story about a skirmish near France that probably didn't happen. He'd shout to the bride and groom and immediately fall over. And of course, the drunk uncle. Every medieval peasant village had one of these.
Village had one. Red-nosed, overly affectionate, and prone to yelling, "Love is war," while trying to dance with someone's grandmother. He'd gift a bent spoon or a suspiciously light jug of ale. Still, it was tradition. But beyond the personalities, the real engine of the wedding was gossip. Weddings were ideal breeding grounds for juicy whispers. Who showed up late? Who looked too cozy with the shepherd? Who brought a gift that looked suspiciously like the one they got last year? Nothing escaped notice. If the bride's dress had a stain, someone had an entire theory. If the groom looked pale, someone declared he'd been hexed. The talk started during the ceremony and would ripple out for weeks, woven into bread lines, passed between milk buckets, and baked into the village's collective memory. And honestly, people lived for it. Life was hard, gossip was free. If you've ever been to a wedding where no one hired a babysitter, now imagine that, but with more mud, fewer teeth, puddles, threw mud balls at chickens, dared each other to touch the priest's donkey. They used turnips as projectiles and haystacks as crash mats. At least one child always ended up in the stew pot. Not in it, thankfully, but close enough to raise questions. Toddlers toddled directly into the ceremony. Babies were strapped to hips or simply plopped onto the ground like satchels. A child would cry every 5 minutes, either because they tripped, were bitten by another child, or had their only snack stolen by a passing hygiene. In truth, weddings were some of the only times children were allowed, even encouraged, to be completely wild. It was understood, let them burn off steam while the adults did the same. If they didn't come back covered in scratches, bruises, and someone else's breadcrumbs, were they even at a wedding? By the end of the day, most children were passed out in hay piles, sticky and exhausted. A few had acquired minor injuries, but no one was surprised either. In the grand tradition of medieval peasant entertainment, well, congratulations, you now had a choir of ale-soaked uncles belting the one wedding song they all kind of remembered. The lyrics were vague, slightly inappropriate, and repeated until someone passed out or forgot the words, whichever came first. Drums, when present, were anything that made noise when hit. Buckets, barrels, one time a well-fed goose in a sack. Rhythmic stomping was also a favorite, particularly useful since it doubled as dancing and scared away rats. The repertoire narrow. Most songs fell into one of 3 categories. Love songs where someone definitely dies at the end, drinking songs where everyone dies at the end, historical ballads where everyone dies and loses their sheep. No one really cared about skill. Volume mattered more than melody. If you were loud and enthusiastic, you were a musician. If you had rhythm, you were a professional. If you could clap in time and not fall over, you were a legend. Children often joined in, adding high-pitched screeches to the mix. Dogs barked along. Occasionally, a rooster would try a solo. It was chaos, and yet, somehow, it worked. The soundscape was clumsy, off-key, occasionally alarming, but it filled the air with joy, or at least with noise, and that was enough. For peasants who rarely heard music beyond a church bell or the sound of rain on a leaking roof, this was magic. Brief, messy magic. Once the music started, and by music we mean rhythmic banging and someone whistling off-key, it was only a matter of time before the dancing began. And by dancing, we don't mean elegant waltzes or courtly steps. We mean stomping, flailing, and vaguely coordinated hopping performed with the unhinged energy of people who'd spent the last 6 months bent over in a barley field. There were no formal dances in peasant villages, no rehearsed routines. What you had was instinctual celebration, deeply chaotic but undeniably sincere. People formed circles, lines, or something between the two and just moved. There might be clapping, slapping, shouting, and stomping, often at the same time, and rarely in rhythm. Feet pounded the earth with enough force to startle birds and churn up mud.
Arms were thrown around shoulders, backs were slapped, sometimes accidentally. The elderly clapped along from the sidelines, cheering on anyone who managed to stay upright longer than 3 songs. Some villagers attempted fancier steps, usually the ones who had visited larger towns or heard tales from a traveling dancer who once passed through 5 years ago. These brave souls would try a spin or a leap only to land awkwardly and pretend they meant to sit down anyway. Shoes were optional. By the second dance, most people had either kicked them off, lost them, or discovered they were slowing them down. Bare feet slapping muddy earth became the percussion section. Occasionally, someone would fall. Everyone would cheer. Falling was part of the ritual. The bride and groom were expected to participate, of course. The crowd would chant, shout encouragement, and sometimes physically shove them into the middle of the circle. They danced while blushing, laughing, or silently begging for someone else to steal the spotlight. Children joined in too, inventing their own moves, which mostly involved spinning until they fell over. One particularly bold child often started a conga line. No one knew where they learned it, they just did. And while no one would call it graceful, the dancing was honest, it was joyful, it was peasants saying, "We're alive, we're fed, we're together, let's move." If music was optional and dancing was blushing, laughing, or silently begging for someone else to steal the spotlight, ale was essential. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without a batload of ale, a home-brewed concoction that served both as a social lubricant and a subtle reminder that this was a celebration, not a cosmopolitan gathering. The ale was rarely fine, more reflection on who brewed it and how little they valued subtlety. Most weddings featured a mix of weak ale, suitable for children and the elderly, and something stronger, which could drop a grown man in 3 cups flat. The latter was often stored in large wooden casks and ladled out like soup. You didn't ask what was in it. You just drank it and hoped you remembered the rest of the evening. Mugs were passed around freely. If you had your own, great. If not, you shared. No one worried about germs, mostly because the concept of germs hadn't been invented yet, and also because ale felt clean. That tingly, burning sensation, that was the sanitizing effect, they said, or possibly blindness. With each round, the crowd got louder, looser, and a bit more chaotic. Polite laughter gave way to belly laughs. Stories became more exaggerated. People started complimenting the bride's smile or the groom's oddly shaped knees. Someone always started a drinking song, which turned into a shouting contest, which then turned into a nap under the table. There was always one person who shouldn't have had that last cup, the kind who began with singing and ended with vomiting behind a haystack. And yet, no one judged. That was just part of the ritual. In a world of hard labor, harsh winters, and looming mortality, ale was more than just a beverage. It was social glue. It made people talk, laugh, confess, and occasionally fall into a trough. And at a wedding, it served one essential purpose: to turn a sacred union into a party no one would remember clearly, but everyone would remember fondly. No medieval peasant wedding was complete without a touch of chaos. Not necessarily planned chaos, but the kind that simmers under the surface until someone's elbow nudges the wrong jug or someone else flirts with the wrong cousin. Let's start with the flirtations. Weddings were matchmaking gold mines. You had music, drink, food, technically, and a field of eligible peasants who'd spent the last 6 months covered in mud and despair. A wedding offered the rare chance to see someone without soot on their face. It was basically medieval speed dating. Glances were exchanged, flowers were awkwardly offered, a few brave souls attempted poetry, which usually involved rhyming hay with May and quickly losing their nerve. The dance floor was prime flirting territory, though most moves involved tripping into someone and pretending it was romantic. Of course, not all flirtations were welcome, and that's where the fights began. The most common triggers: someone danced too closely to someone else's intended, someone spilled ale on a borrowed tunic, or someone insulted someone's goat. Again, the fights were rarely serious, mostly shoving, slurred shouting, and the occasional wrestling match in the mud that no one actually tried to break up. By the time it ended, both parties were too tired or too drunk to remember what they were arguing about. They'd shake hands, share a mug, and move on. Then there were the accidents. Weddings plus livestock plus ale equals unpredictable results. Chickens were frequently stepped on, children fell into barrels, someone always tripped into the stew pot. Once, a goat got tangled in the bride's veil and dragged her 10 feet before anyone noticed. She was fine. The goat was applauded.
But no one was surprised either. Accidents were part of the fun. They gave the villagers stories to tell for years to come. Remember Tomas's wedding when old Magda sat on the beehive? Instant legend. And while nobles had pristine banquets and rehearsed toasts, peasants had spilled ale, accidental kisses, and mild head injuries, and somehow that felt more genuine. At some point in every medieval peasant wedding, right after the fourth drinking song but before the goat stole the bread, someone would look around and ask the question, "Hey, where'd the bride and groom go?" Cue the knowing smirks, the raised eyebrows, the older aunties nudging each other and muttering things like, "Well, they didn't waste time," because everyone knew exactly where the newlyweds were, or at least what they were doing. Consummation wasn't just tradition, it was legally important. In medieval Christian Europe, a marriage wasn't considered fully valid until it was, let's say, made official in the eyes of the Lord and a sagging straw mattress. Technically, some weddings even had witnesses, a disturbing mix of custom and nosiness, though by the later Middle Ages, most villages wisely abandoned that part. The newlyweds usually slipped away to a barn or a back room or a hof that someone had swept for the occasion. Privacy was relative. There were no locks and curtains were a luxury, but the important thing was symbolic disappearance. The community understood. Let them vanish. Let them bond. Meanwhile, back at the feast, the party carried on. The absence of the couple didn't stop the dancing, or the ale, or the off-key singing.
Someone else had acquired a dog. Children were already up, of course, wide awake and sticky, dragging sticks and singing fragments of the wedding song with lyrics they'd invented. One toddler walked past proudly holding a goose egg, and no one knew where he got it or if the goose was okay. The bride and groom likely still hiding, they'd resurface eventually, tasseled, exhausted, and probably with straw in their hair, ready to begin a new life of shared chores, livestock maintenance, and mild existential dread. But on this morning, they were allowed to remain mythical figures. Those with stronger stomachs helped clean. Bread crusts were salvaged, mugs stacked, barrels rolled. Others simply sat on logs, holding their heads and muttering prayers for silence, strong tea, or time travel. The priest walked by with a suspiciously smug look. He hadn't partied. He remembered everything, and worse, he was ready to talk about it. Yet, despite the mess, no one complained. There was a quiet satisfaction in the about prestige. They weren't spectacles meant to impress. There were no photographers, no planners, no mood boards. What there was, and what mattered, was presence. The whole village came out, not just to witness the vows, but to participate in something rare, joy. Because medieval life for peasants wasn't just hard, it was relentless. Hunger, disease, taxes, bad weather, and the occasional armed noble crashing through your barley field. Joy was brief. Fun was suspect, but weddings were the exception, a communal pause in the chaos, a moment where dirt-stained hands held bread instead of tools, and voices sang instead of swearing at rocks. Even if the stew was bland, the ale ran out, or someone got kicked by a donkey, it didn't matter. What mattered was that the village gathered to say, "These two people now face the world together. Let's all shout and spill things in their honor." And so, the legacy of the peasant wedding wasn't captured in stained glass or chronicled in illuminated manuscripts. It lived on in stories told over bread fires, in the song hummed during the next harvest, in the smile between a couple sharing stew months later, now with calloused hands and shared debt. It was in the mud-stree, the goose-related injuries, the whispered gossip that somehow became legend. It was real. It was messy, and it belonged to the people. And if the world ended tomorrow, as it occasionally tried to do in the Middle Ages, the villagers would at least have this memory. A day when life felt lighter, when no one worked, and when two people said yes to each other while chickens clucked disapprovingly nearby. Before the wine was poured or the lyre was plucked, there were rules, lots of them. Despite the chaos and laughter later in the night, the Greek symposium was not some mindless frat party. It was ritualized, exclusive, and strangely sacred. You didn't just show up and start drinking. No, that would have been barbaric. First, you had to be invited.
The host, known as the symposiac, carefully curated the guest list. This was an all-male affair, free-born men only. Slaves, they served. Women, only courtesans or heterae were allowed inside. Wives stayed home. The evening began with a meal, the deipnon, where everyone would eat, reclining on couches, heads propped up on cushions like relaxed philosophers. This wasn't the symposium proper, this was the warm-up. No alcohol yet, that came after. Because once the food was cleared and the floor swept, the real event began. The wine was mixed with water in a large crater. To drink wine unmixed, as the Scythians did, was considered uncivilized. The symposiac decided the ratio. Weak, you're here for conversation. Strong, you're here for chaos. It was a fine line, too, and things stayed stiff. Too drunk, and Plato's dialogues turned into a Dionysian disaster. Now here's where it gets interesting. Every symposium had a purpose, usually philosophical, political, or poetic. But underlying all that was a sense of sacred leisure, what the Greeks called skala. This wasn't wasted time. It was where ideas were born, where young aristocrats sharpened their minds, played verbal games, composed impromptu poetry, and maybe, just maybe, fell in love. Before the debate started, libations were poured to Dionysus, the god of wine and divine madness. There was singing, sometimes by hired musicians, sometimes by the guests themselves. A flute girl might play, a courtesan might challenge a guest to a riddle, but everything was structured. The wine passed clockwise. Each round came with a toast, a song, a witty remark. Wine invited vulnerability, creativity, and occasionally madness. The Greeks believed Dionysus, god of wine, could inspire both divine insight and complete insanity, depending on how much you poured. And pour they did, but not without purpose. There was an art to pacing oneself. A truly respectable guest could drink several rounds, trade clever jabs, recite Homer, and still sit upright. Losing control, that was for barbarians. In fact, the symposium was partly a training ground to show that a real man could enjoy pleasure and still govern himself. Self-control, even in intoxication, was a virtue. That said, not all guests adhered to the ideal. The drunk who danced naked, knocked over the lyre player, or mistook the serving boy for a satyr became the subject of ridicule for years. Stories of symposium disasters were passed around like cautionary tales. But on the flip side, the slightly tipsy philosopher who spoke beautifully on the nature of justice or love might be remembered for eternity. Not every moment at a symposium was philosophical pondering. When the wine flowed and minds loosened, the Greeks turned to games and music, deliberate, structured amusements that revealed a man's spirit, cleverness, and social finesse. The symposium wasn't just a place for intellectual showmanship, it was a playground for performance. One of the most popular games was katarbas, a bizarre and surprisingly elegant pastime. Guests would flick the dregs of their wine at a target, often a saucer balanced on a stand or floating in a bowl of water, trying to knock it over with a well-aimed splash. Success wasn't just about skill, it was symbolic. Man often called out the name of a lover while launching their wine, a cheeky blend of flirtation and athleticism. Hit the mark, the gods approved your passion. Miss? Well, maybe you weren't worthy of her or him. Music was ever present. A flute girl, an olatrix, might play haunting tunes to philosophers. A courtesan might challenge a guest to a riddle. But everything was structured. The wine passed clockwise. Each round came with a jost, a song, a witty remark. Wine invited vulnerability, creativity, and occasionally madness. The Greeks believed Dionysus, god of wine, could inspire both divine insight and complete insanity, depending on how much you poured. And pour they did, but not without purpose. There was an art to pacing oneself. A truly respectable guest could drink several rounds, trade clever jabs, recite Homer, and still sit upright. Losing control, that was for barbarians. In fact, the symposium was partly a training ground to show that a real man could enjoy pleasure and still govern himself.
Self-control, even in intoxication, was a virtue. That said, not all guests adhered to the ideal. The drunk who danced naked, knocked over the lyre player, or mistook the serving boy for a satyr became the subject of ridicule for years. Stories of symposium disasters were passed around like cautionary tales. But on the flip side, the slightly tipsy philosopher who spoke beautifully on the nature of justice or love might be remembered for eternity. Not every moment at a symposium was philosophical pondering. When the wine flowed and minds loosened, the Greeks turned to games and music, deliberate structured amusements that revealed a man's spirit, cleverness, and social finesse. The symposium wasn't just a place for intellectual showmanship, it was a playground for performance. One of the most popular games was Katterbas, a bizarre and surprisingly elegant pastime. Guests would flick the dregs of their wine at a target, often a saucer balanced on a stand or floating in a bowl of water, trying to knock it over with a well-aimed splash. Success wasn't just about skill, it was symbolic. Men often called out the name of a lover while launching their wine, a cheeky blend of flirtation and athleticism. Hit the mark, the gods approved your passion. Miss, well, maybe you weren't worthy of her or him. Music was ever present. A flute girl, an olatrix, might play haunting tunes to philosophers. A courtesan might challenge a guest to a riddle, but everything was structured. The wine passed clockwise. Each round came with a toast, a song, a witty remark. Wine invited vulnerability, creativity, and occasionally madness. The Greeks believed Dionysus, god of wine, could inspire both divine insight and complete insanity, depending on how much you poured. And pour they did, but not without purpose. There was an art to pacing oneself. A truly respectable guest could drink several rounds, trade clever jabs, recite Homer, and still sit upright. Losing control, that was for barbarians. In fact, the symposium was partly a training ground to show that a real man could enjoy pleasure and still govern himself. Self-control, even in intoxication, was a virtue. That said,
Much as comfort. The truth, perhaps, is that necessity outweighed preference, and cultural norms bent under the pressure of freezing winters. Let your senses fill the scene. The air inside the bed canopy is warmer, filled with the mingled smell of wool, straw, and breath. Quilts weigh heavily on your chest, pressing you into the mattress. You hear the sound of slow breathing, the cough of someone fighting a cold, the occasional creak of the bed frame. Outside, wind claws at the shutters, but inside, the nest of bodies feels like a single organism, every heartbeat contributing to the fragile warmth. Curiously, some households included not just family, but hired hands or neighbors in this shared sleep. A traveler might be invited to squeeze into a bed if storms made the journey home impossible. Hospitality in such times wasn't just kindness, it was the only way to ensure everyone made it through the night. Imagine the awkward politeness of strangers sliding under the same quilt, the first minutes filled with stiff silence before fatigue and cold erased boundaries. Folklore and memory preserve stories of children whispering to each other in the dark, inventing games to distract from the numbness creeping into their toes. They told riddles, sang snatches of songs, or listened to tales whispered by parents about warmer lands. These nighttime rituals became part of the fabric of survival, shared warmth wrapped not only in quilts, but also in words. There's still disagreement among researchers about just how common multifamily sleeping really was. Some diaries mention it constantly, while others insist on separate pallets or lofts. Geography played a role. In harsher northern climates, communal beds were more likely, while in milder regions, families sometimes risked the luxury of space. The debate underscores how flexible survival strategies could be, bending to the demands of weather, resources, and culture. Now picture the quilt itself, heavy, patchworked, stitched from scraps of old dresses, coats, or flour sacks.
Feathers, if available, puffed its interior, but more often it was simply layer upon layer of fabric sewn tight. You run your fingers over uneven stitches, each one a mark of care. These blankets weren't bought in stores, they were survival tools made by hands that knew cold all too well. One unusual practice, recalled in Scandinavian immigrant families, was to hang fur pelts over quilts, creating a final shield against icy air. Deer hides, bear skins, or even sheep fleeces turned into makeshift duvets. The smell of animal lingered in the fibers, mingling with smoke and sweat, but the warmth was undeniable. Children sometimes fought over who got the good fur, the one that smelled less pungent or felt softer to the touch. The intimacy of these arrangements carried psychological weight. In the darkest nights, pressed so closely together, families found reassurance. Even when the wind howled outside, even when snow drifted high against the door, they had each other's heat. That bond, forged by survival, shaped memories of childhood for decades to come. Some memoirs recall distracting children from the bite of the cold. Each touch, each whispered word, each sigh under heavy quilts was a calculated act of endurance, stitched seamlessly into family life. As you sink into this image, let yourself feel the press of those quilts, the weight of shared breath, and the small miracle of body heat keeping frost at bay. It isn't glamorous, it isn't private, but it is survival. And in the stillness of the night, it is enough. You linger in that crowded bed for a moment longer, quilts piled high, bodies pressed close, until you notice the stitching and the fabric itself. Those layers weren't simply bought, they were earned, stitched, patched, and repurposed from every scrap a household could muster. On the frontier, bedding became both art and armor, holding together families against the long assault of winter. Surviving records from household inventories confirm just how prized feather beds, wool blankets, and quilts were. A feather mattress filled with goose or duck down could keep sleepers warm even when ice spread across the inside of windows. Quilts sewn from worn-out clothing told the history of the family through fabric. A piece of a child's first dress might sit beside a square from a father's discarded work shirt. When stitched together, the quilt became a living chronicle as well as a shield. One little-known custom among some rural households was the trundle quilt, deliberately made oversized so it could spill across the floor, sealing the gap where icy drafts crept under the bed. Historians argue that the feather bed became a symbol of status on the frontier, a mark that a family had secured enough flocks or trade to afford such comfort. Let your senses explore the bedding more closely. Run your hands over a quilt's uneven stitches, the fabric softened by years of use. The smell is a blend of smoke from the fire, soap from the occasional wash, and the faint mustiness of damp cloth that never quite dries in winter. When you slide under it, the weight presses you down comfortingly, cocooning you against the drafts that prowl the corners of the room. Curiously, in certain immigrant traditions, quilts carried spiritual meaning as well as physical warmth. Scandinavian families sometimes embroidered protective symbols into the corners, believing the stitching warded off misfortune during the long nights. German settlers spoke of spirit threads, bits of red yarn woven through quilts to guard children from illness. These details remind you that bedding wasn't only a practical tool, it was woven with memory, belief, and a kind of quiet magic. Imagine lying beneath such a quilt while snow rattles against the shutters. The fabric feels heavy, almost immovable, pinning you into a safe cocoon. Children wriggle beneath it like restless kittens, feet kicking, bodies twisting, while parents murmur for stillness. The closeness makes every sound louder, a sigh, a cough, the whisper of fabric shifting, and yet the quilt muffles the worst of the cold, turning a fragile log cabin into a semblance of home. Experts disagree about just how often families manage to keep bedding dry. Some argue that in tightly sealed cabins, smoke and condensation made quilts perpetually damp, their insulation weakened by moisture. Others insist that careful drying near the hearth restored warmth each day. Perhaps both are true. Some nights quilts clung to sleepers with clammy heaviness, while other nights they crackled with dry warmth straight from the fire. There's something poignant about the image of children snuggling beneath a quilt stitched from your worn overcoat, traded for a week's worth of food, to wrap your children warm, hoping in return to feed them through the next week. Each piece of bedding carried enormous value, both practical and emotional. In sensory terms, the bedding often smelled strongly of whatever household chore it had last endured. Quilts reeked faintly of wood smoke, wool blankets of lanolin, feather beds of musty down. Over time, these scents became inseparable from the experience of winter nights. To the modern nose, it might seem pungent or unpleasant. To those families, it was simply the fragrance of survival. Even the act of making bedding shaped community life. Quilting bees, gatherings where women stitched together patchwork, became moments of social bonding, swapping stories and songs while their hands worked. The finished quilt represented not just protection, but also the collective labor of friends and neighbors. In this way, warmth was literally stitched by many hands, a communal effort against the loneliness of winter. Picture the rhythm of such a gathering, the scrape of needles pulling thread, the laughter echoing in a chilly room, steam rising from mugs of cider. Children ran underfoot while adults bent over fabric, creating patterns that would soon lie across beds in snowbound cabins. The quilt that resulted carried those voices within its stitches, every square a reminder that no family faced the frontier entirely alone. Of course, not every bed cover was simple, coarse, and purely functional. Old grain sacks stitched together, layered blankets, flannel sheets, each requiring different approaches to cleaning and care. Wool blankets from sources like South American Ospo, said to be exceptionally warm, could be beaten with sticks to remove dust, but wet only well away from the imminent threat of frost. Feather beds that were luxuries required mastery of care, tossed and aired daily to keep them from becoming matted and hard. In this way, in the coldest, frigid nights, it is life itself. And as you drift deeper, the quilt's weight presses away the cold, letting your mind slide softly toward dreams. The quilt presses down on you, holding in the warmth, but your attention drifts toward the edges of the cabin, the places where cold always found a way in. Even the thickest quilts or warmest bodies could be defeated by a stubborn draft, slipping through cracks.
Practical. Anything that plugged a hole kept a family alive. In sensory terms, the sealed windows carried their own atmosphere. Oiled paper, when lit from within, cast a soft amber glow, blurring faces into silhouettes. Wool rugs over doors muffled outside noise, wrapping the cabin in a strange, insulated silence. The air became thick with breath and smoke, less fresh, but safer. Imagine lying in such a room, the world reduced to flickering shadows, your ears filled only with the sound of fire crackling and the steady breathing of loved ones. Occasionally, ingenuity went further. Families placed barrels of water against drafty walls, believing the thermal mass would absorb cold air before it reached the bed. Others stacked firewood along walls to block cracks, turning supplies into insulation. These odd strategies transformed ordinary objects into tools of survival. And yet the cold always found its way back in. Diaries describe waking to snow that had drifted through keyholes or sifted between logs, dusting blankets like powdered sugar. Imagine brushing frost from your hair, shaking snow from your quilt, and realizing it had fallen inside your own home.
The cabin might be sealed as best it could, but winter never stopped testing its defenses. Children grew up remembering the rituals of sealing windows as part of bedtime itself. One memoir recalled the draft hunt when siblings competed to find the coldest crack and plug it fastest. Another described the joy of standing close to a shutter after it was patched, proud that the icy sting had vanished. These games masked the seriousness of the task, teaching the next generation to turn hardship into habit. The debates among modern historians continue. Were frontier homes truly livable through the coldest months, or did families endure nights of near constant shivering despite all precautions? Some argue that only the healthiest survived, while others highlight the adaptability of human bodies to extreme conditions. What seems certain is that sealing windows and doors wasn't optional. It was the nightly ceremony that stood between survival and collapse. As you settle back in this imagined cabin, you feel the difference once the shutters are barred, the cracks stuffed, the quilt hung over the door. The room grows quieter, stiller, less hostile. The wind outside still howls, but it no longer bites your skin. You draw the quilt closer, sink deeper into the straw mattress, and drift towards sleep, knowing that the fortress may not be perfect, but for tonight it is enough. The shutters are sealed now, rugs and quilts hanging thick across the cracks. But there's another form of warmth stirring in the cabin, a warmth that breathes, shifts, and occasionally snores. Families didn't always rely only on each other's bodies. They sometimes welcomed their animals into the nighttime circle. Dogs, cats, and, on the harshest nights, even livestock stepped across the threshold, their presence reshaping the way frontier people endured winter. It is well recorded in farm journals and pioneer memoirs that families deliberately coaxed their cow into the cabin on the coldest nights, the animal standing near the door while children slept within arm's reach. The smell must have been powerful, the space cramped beyond belief, yet the heat from a full-bodied creature outweighed the inconvenience. "We shared the winter with our Bessie," the farmer's daughter wrote, "and never were the warmer for it." Researchers remain divided about just how common such practices were. Some argue that bringing animals inside posed too many health hazards, disease, parasites, filth. Others contend that in the direst circumstances, practicality trumped hygiene, and families did what they had to do. The absence of widespread documentation may say less about rarity than about embarrassment. After all, who wanted to admit they had slept nose to tail with their pig just to avoid frostbite? Now close your eyes and imagine the sensory detail. You're lying beneath a heavy quilt, and at your feet a dog shifts, sighing into the straw. Its fur smells of smoke and earth, its body heat seeping through the covers into your toes. Somewhere nearby, a cat needs a blanket, its purr vibrating against the silence. And in the far corner, a goat rustles in its pen, breathing softly, the faint odor of hay mixing with wood smoke. The sounds and scents aren't refined, but they make the room feel alive, a chorus of beings resisting the winter together. One curious practice noted in Scandinavian immigrant families was the building of animal corners inside the cabin, small enclosed stalls where sheep or goats could spend the night. The warmth from these animals raised the temperature enough.
Practical. Anything that plugged a hole kept a family alive. In sensory terms, the sealed windows carried their own atmosphere. Oiled paper, when lit from within, cast a soft amber glow, blurring faces into silhouettes. Wool rugs over doors muffled outside noise, wrapping the cabin in a strange, insulated silence. The air became thick with breath and smoke, less fresh, but safer. Imagine lying in such a room, the world reduced to flickering shadows, your ears filled only with the sound of fire crackling and the steady breathing of loved ones. Occasionally, ingenuity went further.
Families placed barrels of water against drafty walls, believing the thermal mass would absorb cold air before it reached the bed. Others stacked firewood along walls to block cracks, turning supplies into insulation. These odd strategies transformed ordinary objects into tools of survival. And yet the cold always found its way back in. Diaries describe waking to snow that had drifted through keyholes or sifted between logs, dusting blankets like powdered sugar. Imagine brushing frost from your hair, shaking snow from your quilt, and realizing it had fallen inside your own home. The cabin might be sealed as best it could, but winter never stopped testing its defenses. Children grew up remembering the rituals of sealing windows as part of bedtime itself. One memoir recalled the draft hunt when siblings competed to find the coldest crack and plug it fastest. Another described the joy of standing close to a shutter after it was patched, proud that the icy sting had vanished. These games masked the seriousness of the task, teaching the next generation to turn hardship into habit. The debates among modern historians continue. Were frontier homes truly livable through the coldest months, or did families endure nights of near constant shivering despite all precautions? Some argue that only the healthiest survived, while others highlight the adaptability of human bodies to extreme conditions. What seems certain is that sealing windows and doors wasn't optional. It was the nightly ceremony that stood between survival and collapse. As you settle back in this imagined cabin, you feel the difference once the shutters are barred, the cracks stuffed, the quilt hung over the door. The room grows quieter, stiller, less hostile. The wind outside still howls, but it no longer bites your skin. You draw the quilt closer, sink deeper into the straw mattress, and drift towards sleep, knowing that the fortress may not be perfect, but for tonight it is enough. The shutters are sealed now, rugs and quilts hanging thick across the cracks. But there's another form of warmth stirring in the cabin, a warmth that breathes, shifts, and occasionally snores. Families didn't always rely only on each other's bodies. They sometimes welcomed their animals into the nighttime circle. Dogs, cats, and, on the harshest nights, even livestock stepped across the threshold, their presence reshaping the way frontier people endured winter. It is well recorded in farm journals and pioneer memoirs that families deliberately coaxed their cow into the cabin on the coldest nights, the animal standing near the door while children slept within arm's reach. The smell must have been powerful, the space cramped beyond belief, yet the heat from a full-bodied creature outweighed the inconvenience. "We shared the winter with our Bessie," the farmer's daughter wrote, "and never were the warmer for it." Researchers remain divided about just how common such practices were. Some argue that bringing animals inside posed too many health hazards, disease, parasites, filth. Others contend that in the direst circumstances, practicality trumped hygiene, and families did what they had to do. The absence of widespread documentation may say less about rarity than about embarrassment. After all, who wanted to admit they had slept nose to tail with their pig just to avoid frostbite? Now close your eyes and imagine the sensory detail. You're lying beneath a heavy quilt, and at your feet a dog shifts, sighing into the straw. Its fur smells of smoke and earth, its body heat seeping through the covers into your toes. Somewhere nearby, a cat needs a blanket, its purr vibrating against the silence. And in the far corner, a goat rustles in its pen, breathing softly, the faint odor of hay mixing with wood smoke. The sounds and
Inventions of people facing drafts with scraps of fabric? Some scholars argue that cultural memory carried the idea across the Atlantic, while others suggest necessity reinvented the practice wherever winters demanded. In either case, the fabric shielded countless sleepers from the cruelest touch of night air. Morning brought its own rituals. Curtains were drawn aside, their folds stiff with frost at the edges. Children emerged yawning, hair static with the trapped air, while parents folded fabric carefully to protect it from sparks or damp. The bubble dissolved, and the family returned to the shared reality of the cold cabin. But for those hours of darkness, the curtain had created a fragile paradise, thin cloth between them and the wilderness. Even now, echoes linger in modern comfort. The heavy duvets and enclosed sleeping bags we take camping echo the same principle. Trap the heat, hold it close, survive the night. The ingenuity of those frontier bed curtains whispers through time, reminding us that even the simplest fabric, hung with care, could mean the difference between life and death. So, as you sink deeper into the imagined room, feel the curtain brushing softly against your skin. Hear the muffled quiet within its folds, and let the sense of enclosure reassure you. Outside, the wind rattles against the shutters. Inside, your little tent of fabric holds warmth like a secret, keeping you safe until dawn. The canopy sways faintly in your mind's eye, fabric whispering with every breath. But beneath those quilts, inside that fragile fortress of cloth, another weapon against the cold was always present: the clothes you wore to bed. Today, many imagine sleepwear as a luxury, soft pajamas, thin cotton. But on the frontier, sleep clothing was armor, layered deliberately, each piece chosen to keep death at bay. It is widely acknowledged from household records and letters that frontier families rarely stripped down at night in the way modern sleepers do. Instead, they climbed under quilts fully dressed, often in the very garments worn all day. Wool shirts, thick stockings, long undergarments, and knitted caps were part of the nightly ritual. Nightgowns existed, but only if a family had fabric to spare. For most, practicality came first. What you wore during the day, you likely wore to bed, adding layers as needed. A curious but revealing tidbit comes from journals describing nightcaps, those woolen or linen hats that kept heads from losing heat. Children wore them with flaps tied beneath the chin, giving them an almost comical look in the dark. Without them, and oral histories hint at both experiences, some families swore by heavy layering, while others learned to balance warmth with ventilation, discovering the line between comfort and clammy misery. Now, let yourself feel it. You climb beneath quilts already weighted with history. But tonight, you're wrapped in layers. Wool stockings scratch against your calves, a coarse linen shirt clings to your chest, and a cap hugs your head so tightly you hear the faint rustle of fabric with each movement. Your breath warms the inside of the cap, dampening it. But the alternative, naked skin against icy air, would be unthinkable. In immigrant households, certain traditions colored the choices of sleepwear. Scandinavian settlers often swaddled children in layers of sheepskin or fur, fastening them with strips of cloth like little winter cocoons. German families prized wool undergarments, knitted thick and long enough to cover the wrists and ankles. English settlers clung to their long shirts, garments that doubled as both daywear and nightwear, simple but layered. Infrequent washing was the rule, not the exception. Wool retained odor, and linen nightshirts rarely saw soap during the long winter months. To us, the thought of sleeping for weeks in the same garments might sound unbearable, yet to them it was simple reality. Water froze, soap was precious, and survival mattered more than scent. Diaries sometimes joke about the companionable smell of the household at night, a humor sharpened by necessity. Imagine the sensory picture more fully. You stretch your feet within coarse wool, almost impossible. Parents laughed at their bundled children, but they also knew that each extra layer meant another chance to wake with rosy cheeks instead of blue lips. Researchers remained divided on the symbolic meaning of sleepwear, too. Was it simply utilitarian, or did it carry a sense of modesty and dignity in shared sleeping arrangements? Some argue that night clothes preserved privacy in households where everyone slept side by side. Others believe modesty was a luxury frontier families could not afford. Morning stirred stiffly, peeling off night layers with reluctance. Shirts and stockings were stiff with sweat or frost, caps askew, hair flattened beneath them.
The first step onto the icy floor made the body shiver, but the knowledge lingered. The clothes had done their job. They had carried you through another night. Now, as you rest in this imagined cabin, you feel the scratch of wool, the heaviness of layers, the odd comfort of a cap pulled low. It isn't glamorous, and it isn't meant to be. It is survival stitched into fabric, worn to bed because warmth is worth more than beauty. Wrapped so tightly, you drift into sleep, grateful for every coarse thread guarding you against the darkness. The quilt presses heavy against you, your wool cap pulled low, but the fire still glows faintly in the hearth. And here, in the stillness of midnight, another kind of warmth joins the arsenal of survival. Warmth carried directly into bed. Frontier families discovered that stones, bricks, and even pieces of iron could become little suns if heated in the fire, wrapped carefully and tucked beneath quilts. These glowing bundles might seem simple, but on the coldest nights they meant the difference between restful slumber and hours of bone-deep shivering. Evidence from diaries and household notes make it clear that the bed warmer was a beloved tool. Some households owned metal pans with long handles designed to scoop coals and slide them across the mattress before sleep. Others relied on simpler methods, bricks heated in the coals or flat river stones warmed all day by the fire. Once glowing with heat, these objects were wrapped in cloth, slipped under quilts, and left to radiate comfort through the night. The glow itself didn't last long, but for a few blessed hours it softened the icy air. One curious recollection from a settler's memoir mentions potatoes baked in the hearth, then tied in cloth and carried to bed. Children clutched them like dolls, warming small hands as they drifted off. By morning, the potatoes were cold and shriveled, but still edible, a practical blend of supper and survival. The detail might raise a smile now, but to those families it was a clever merging of food and heat in a world that offered little of either. Researchers are still divided over how widespread such practices were. Some argue that only households with surplus firewood or iron tools could afford to waste fuel on heating stones. Others suggest the custom was nearly universal, since even the poorest cabins had access to rocks and a hearth. What is certain is that stories of hot bricks and sharp but oddly comforting heat. In a world of harsh deprivation, this small luxury feels almost extravagant. One unusual practice among Dutch immigrants involved filling earthenware jugs with hot water, corking them tightly, and slipping them under quilts. The jugs radiated warmth for hours and could be reheated easily each evening. Some families even carried them into sleighs or wagons, turning winter travel into a slightly less punishing ordeal. Imagine the clink of pottery against wooden bed frames, the steam rising as corks hissed loose in the morning. Debates among historians focus on the safety of these practices. Some argue that hot coals in pans posed enormous fire risks, especially in straw-filled cabins. Indeed, stories survive of bedding igniting, flames racing across quilts before being beaten out in panic. Others insist that the risks were manageable, pointing out that careful wrapping and experience kept accidents rare. Perhaps the reality lies in the middle. Families balanced the gamble of fire against the certainty of frost. Now, picture the rituals of evening. A child crouches by the hearth, poking a stone deeper into glowing coals. A mother checks the cloth wrapping, frowning at a singed edge. The father lifts the warm stone carefully, tongs in hand, before sliding it into the bed. The family exhales in unison when the heat spreads through the quilts. These moments carried more drama than modern households can easily imagine. The fire had to be coaxed just right, the heat captured at just the right time, the bedding adjusted to trap it all. In sensory memory, these bed warmers left powerful impressions. One pioneer recalled the smell of wool smoldering where a stone pressed too close. The fabric singed, but the warmth irresistible. Another wrote that she could always tell when the stone cooled because her dreams shifted from soft to restless, and she awoke pulling quilts tighter. The stones became part of the rhythm of sleep itself. And yet, improvisation never ended. When stones weren't available, families turned to whatever they had. Iron tools, kettles filled with hot water, even small sacks of heated sand. Some native techniques adopted by settlers used heated earth buried in pits beneath bedding, though these were less common in cabins. The creativity reveals how determined families were to harness every flicker of warmth from their environment. Children often treasured these warm bundles like companions. Letters describe youngsters naming their heated stones, carrying them from hearth to bed like cherished